So, in regards to COVID-19, what public vaccines are out there?
Yeah, and so when you use the word public vaccines, you could probably say all of them. And I say that because public means that there's been some dedication of public resources towards the development of those vaccines. And the way science works is that it's not just out of nowhere these things emerged. It's been decades and decades of slow, laborious basic science to figure out that this is the vaccine that would work in this time. And so if you look at, say, the mRNA vaccines, they've been being worked on from the public funding perspective. In Canada, CIHR, which is our public funder. In the United States, the NIH, which is their public research funder, over 30 years has spent money on the foundational work to develop these vaccines. Then over the past, say, few years, that public money has then just been usurped, but for private interests, where those products were developed in public spaces then get pushed towards the private space for development and ongoing recoupment of costs. And so what you do in that context is that you socialize all of this risk but privatize all of the benefit. And that sort of speaks to a lot of our ongoing drug development processes, whereby all of the work that's foundational to all of it is spent by public dollars, but all of the private benefits are private. Other vaccines, and so if you look around the world, most of the vaccines have similar frameworks whereby all their foundational work is done in public labs. Some of them have more public infrastructure attached to their development. Say, if you look at the Cuban vaccine, if you look at the Chinese vaccine, all of those were more publicly developed and sold, not just their foundational science work.
Maybe this is a silly question, but is it even possible to have an 100% public vaccine, no private interests, anything like this?
Like, if you look at the Cuban vaccine, and I know that looking to Cuba as an example for Canadians is always seen as anathema. That being said, their vaccine, which was developed at public labs and tested through their social healthcare system and is owned by their government, is a true public vaccine, and it's owned by their people. And they're sharing the ability to manufacture that vaccine with people around the world and companies around the world and governments around the world who want to be able to make it. And so without a doubt, if the system is in place, there can be public ownership of goods. That being said, in Canada, that system is not really in place. And so our public labs and, say, our National Microbiology Laboratory, which is in Winnipeg, developed and did a lot of the work of the Ebola vaccine, which is being used in Congo right now. They have an outbreak. But they weren't able to push it across a finish line for development and testing and so on until they were able to get private industry to do it. And that speaks to some of the challenges that we have in our system, where we don't have the sort of capacity or willingness, I would say, to have public ownership of goods.
So I guess, is it the lack of funding that, requires private funding in order to do things like testing, stuff like this?
Not necessarily. I think funding is obviously important to do testing, but I think more important is an acknowledgement that these public health tools should be owned by government interests, not necessarily private interests. I think we, through our, and I'm going to slightly editorialize here, through our neoliberal models of healthcare, have decided that, public ownership and public delivery is only so good. We need the private industry and private sector to deliver certain aspects of healthcare. And that sort of abrogation of responsibility towards private interests has kind of led us to where we are, where we have a system whereby the public sector can only do so much, but relies on the private sector with all of its strengths and all of its weaknesses to do much of the work. And so it's more of less funding and more policy and capacity and willingness to have a more pushy public infrastructure in this space. And the reason I say pushy is that you sort of need to have that interests of the public at first and foremost to have that laid out appropriately. And the private sector does not necessarily have that. And so they have their strengths because they can get things to market very quickly, but not necessarily in a better way, as the mRNA vaccines have proven.
What do you think maybe rerouting our system to no longer need to rely on the private system in terms of vaccines? What could this look like? Is this a crazy ton of work?
It seems outlandish, but remember, Canada had a system for this up until the mid-70s. If you look into the history of the Connaught Labs, which is a lab in the University of Toronto that was developed back in the 20s, back when insulin was discovered, insulin being an important drug to treat diabetes. And that lab was owned by sort of the university and then subsequently by the government of Ontario to produce goods of public health need. And they did that, and they did that at reasonable cost and so on, and developed products and scaled out products and sold products and so on. But then over time, as once again austerity and neoliberalism take hold in the 70s and 80s, it was seen as not really a sustainable model because of private industry taking over that sector. And the funding was lost, but more so policies weren't in place to ensure that it had the sustainability and infrastructure to continue. And so we have a model in Canada where we've done it before. It just needs to be thought about and reestablished going forward. What I'm nervous about, particularly with how we're doing our sort of local biomanufacturing policies, and specific to Montreal, how we're allowing Moderna and Novavax to exploit/use government resources to develop and scale out products for their private interests without necessarily responding to the public health needs of the time.
Could you elaborate a little bit more on public health needs?
Sure. And so obviously things change, and in a pandemic you want a vaccine or a therapeutic or a test for that pandemic. But outside of a pandemic, you still need medications, you still need vaccines, and a lot of these products aren't being made at the scale they need to, and aren't being made at the cost that's appropriate for a population writ large. And that population can be in Canada, but that population also can be around the world. And so if Canada says we want cheap insulin, for example, that needs to happen because it's a public health need. And they can make a government-made facility to make that product, and it's just a matter of having the capacity and policy structures and intellectual property to do such things. We don't really have that right now. Right now, what we'll say is, Moderna, you do what you want, and we'll buy those products off of you when those products become available, whatever those products may be. And so without a public health driven agenda for these companies, it becomes sort of, we're sort of chasing the companies along the way. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. Thank you. And then in terms of the patent on the COVID vaccine, how does this affect Canadians, in terms of the spread of new variants and maybe any other factors you might want to speak about?
Sure. Obviously, there's a lot of attention right now on the intellectual property related to the COVID vaccines. And there's government hearings and all of these conversations right now. And yes, intellectual property is a major component of accessibility to these vaccines. And I think fundamentally what we need to remember is that regions, countries need to be somewhat autonomous and somewhat able to respond to their public health needs and not dependent on the whims or the availabilities of places around the world. And so if there's an outbreak of something in sub-Saharan Africa tomorrow that would be beneficial from an mRNA type vaccine, they wouldn't be able to respond in as quick a way as they would need, and would have to wait for foreign interests to be interested enough to develop a product accordingly. And so if you look at a disease like I don't know, tuberculosis, for example, where it's been hundreds of years of millions of deaths, and we still don't have an adequate vaccine for that. And that's partially related to the attention and partially related to the inability of folks who are most burdened with infectious diseases not being able to drive the research and policy agendas as to which diseases get money and attention. And having intellectual property so that they can make or have the platform to make vaccines against those diseases that they care about will help sort of reduce those disease burdens. The reason we have COVID-19 vaccines is because us in Canada were affected by it. If it was purely a disease limited to sub-Saharan Africa, like so many other diseases are, there wouldn't be as much attention on it necessarily. Will intellectual property in and of itself solve all of the problems? Or waiving intellectual property? Not necessarily. There's a whole number of other things that go along with it in terms of capacity and technology transfer and the knowledge sets and having enough engineers and so on. But it's a major part of it and needs to be integrated into how we sort of think about a drug development system that's future-proofed and responsive to needs.
What do you think that regular Canadians can do to, push back against the privatization of, vaccines and just the intellectual property of the vaccine itself?
Yeah, and like everyone's very quick to blame pharmaceutical companies. Being sort of private stakeholders who are responsive to shareholders, and they think, oh, we should just ask Pfizer, ask Moderna to do their, so be nice, and why can't they just be nicer? And like, yes, that'd be great, but I think more sort of fundamentally, like in healthcare, we always speak for system design, and the famous quote is, every system is perfectly designed to get the results that it achieves. And so the results that we've achieved in our system, it's exactly what we wish we should expect, namely that these companies that are responsive to private interests would serve those private interests. And so what we need to do is, what regular Canadians can do is sort of think about what system would be better at producing a system that responds to public interests. And those systems are different than our current sort of private sector-led processes, and sort of have a more robust public approach to tools of public health goods. And I may be a ranting communist in some ways, but in some ways, like having like these public sector driven protocols whereby we own collectively these goods, and this is a good that's necessary for public well-being, like roads and lighthouses and other things like that. We need to make sure that we have control of those things and can deliver them appropriately. And so, in sum, what can regular Canadians do? Overthrow capitalism.
So we have a lot of work to do.
Yeah.
I guess during the pandemic, have you noticed a push to privatize our healthcare system, just as a result of how things are functioning?
Yeah, no, and that's been the common response, I guess. We see strains in our publicly funded, publicly delivered healthcare hospital system, and the knee-jerk response from most folks is, you see, this is the problem with a public sector-led response. We need to privatize, and the private sector will solve all of our problems. And that's, like, in some ways, yeah, sure, because there's a problem in the system, you change the system. But you also don't think about how sort of that system, that public system, has been sort of chipped and ruined over the course of the past number of decades, so that this is the results that you're going to achieve. And the solution is not to change it to a private-led system because we see how those systems work elsewhere around the world, but we change it to a system that's more responsive to the needs of the public. And so provide it the appropriate amount of money, provide it the appropriate amount of governance and oversight, and respond to the needs of the communities accordingly. And so yes, this pandemic has led some actors to say, you know what, we need to privatize more. I'd argue that this pandemic has showed me no, the opposite. We need to really ensure that our public system is what it needs to be and not this shell of itself. And so almost doubling down in a way. And so more universality, more equity-driven processes, which the private sector will not deliver.
Thank you so much. Is there anything that I didn't ask that you'd like to share or think that I should look into?
No, these are like long and like ambitious type conversations. It's not like this is a simple answer. And so oftentimes, like when I'm speaking to media or other folks about like these broader issues, because like everyone just wants to know, oh, like what's the case count today, or what can we do in Canada? Should we wear masks, or so on? But all of those things, while important, aren't really like the long form type approach that we need to take to something like this. And this pandemic has highlighted where the problems lie. And so I think it's going to be a hard story for you to tell because these are complicated stories to tell, truthfully. And like, I'm not the first person to rant against the system because the system has been ranted against forever. And it's just us ranting into the void. And so how do we make social movements last? And how do we make that change persistent and all of these things? And this is just a small sliver of that larger battle.